Jasmine Crockett, a black woman who was just 1 minute late, was immediately slapped with a $500 fine. But no one could have predicted that this very moment would mark the beginning of a confrontation that would shake the entire courtroom and the justice system to its core. She faced not only discrimination and injustice in the courtroom, but also took a bold action that left the judge and everyone present stunned. Could that 1 minute change a legal system that has existed for decades? And what happens when good rises to defend itself against a courtroom full of power and indifference? Follow this story, because the truth isn't always in the hands of the powerful. The sun had barely started to peek over the horizon, casting fragile rays of light through the blinds and splashing them across the wooden floor of the bedroom. The air was still, and the only sound that filled the room was the steady ticking of the clock on the nightstand. Jasmine Crockett stirred in her sleep, her eyes slowly fluttering open as the first rays of sunlight brushed against her face. She blinked, trying to adjust to the new day, but it felt like time itself was suspended in that single moment. It was just another morning, the kind of morning that carried with it the mundane rhythm of daily life, the kind of morning that didn't seem to demand anything from you. No expectations, no pressing urgency. Jasmine inhaled deeply, feeling the warmth of the soft cotton blanket surrounding her, the familiar sensation of comfort in her own bed. It was peaceful, almost comforting, but there was something else, a faint sense of anticipation building in her chest, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. As she slowly pushed herself up from the bed, the stillness of the room seemed almost heavy, as though it was holding its breath. It felt like the calm before a storm, though she couldn't yet identify the source of the storm. Jasmine wasn't someone to get lost in her thoughts or overanalyze every feeling, but today felt different. She shook off the feeling, as if she could simply will it away, and reached for the curtains, pulling them open with a swift motion. The bright sunlight streamed in, casting long shadows across the floor, and for a moment, she was caught in the beauty of the quiet morning. She glanced at the clock on the wall, 7 a.m., a perfect time to start her routine. There was no rush, no reason to hurry. Everything felt normal, predictable, like 1,000 mornings before it. Jasmine stretched as she stood up, the tension in her muscles reminding her of the long hours she had been working lately. The same rhythm every day, a cup of coffee, a shower, a moment of quiet before diving headfirst into the chaos of her life. Stepping into the bathroom, the soft scent of soap and body wash surrounded her as she moved through the motions of getting ready. The mirror reflected her image back at her, sharp, focused eyes, a look of quiet determination. She wasn't just any woman. She was Jasmine Crockett, strong, accomplished, unshakable. She had spent years building her career, fighting for justice, proving herself to a world that often overlooked her. Today was no different, or so she thought. But as she brushed her teeth, she noticed something. The familiar tension in her chest had returned. It wasn't the usual stress of a busy schedule, the normal pressure she'd faced countless times before. No, this was something else, a gnawing feeling that made her pause for a moment, as if something was off, something wasn't right. She couldn't place it, but it was there, lurking at the edge of her consciousness. After a moment of hesitation, she pushed the feeling aside. Jasmine didn't have time for doubt. She was no stranger to adversity. She had faced political battles, high-profile legal cases, and even personal struggles that would have broken most people, but she had endured and had come out stronger each time. So why was today different? She finished getting ready and stood in front of the mirror for a brief moment. Her reflection seemed to stare back at her, almost challenging her. She wasn't afraid, not of the challenges ahead. She had never been the type to be intimidated. But today, something about her own reflection seemed to whisper that things were about to shift in ways she couldn't yet understand. Jasmine dressed quickly, choosing her usual attire, a crisp white shirt, sleek black trousers, and a navy blazer. It was the uniform of someone who meant business, who was always ready for whatever came next. As she pulled on her blazer, she felt the familiar sense of power settle over her. This was her armor. With it, she could face anything, any challenge, any opposition, any injustice. It was 7:30 a.m. when she left her apartment, stepping out into the cool morning air. Her black BMW awaited her, gleaming in the driveway. Jasmine wasn't a woman who indulged in excess, but this car was different. It represented years of hard work, sacrifice, and determination. She had worked for it, earned it, and now, as she slid into the driver's seat, it felt like a tangible reminder of her strength and success. She started the engine, the car humming to life beneath her. With a press of a button, the radio turned on. The familiar voice of NPR filled the silence as she drove through the quiet streets. Tensions are escalating over the new executive order. The announcer's voice droned on, recounting the latest developments in a legal battle that had been raging for weeks. Jasmine's ears perked up as the conversation turned to a proposal she had been a key part of crafting. "Is this what's been on your mind?" she thought, a sense of unease creeping into her thoughts. The order was controversial, and the political debates around it had grown increasingly heated. As she listened to the arguments being laid out, lawyers, politicians, talking heads, all she could think about was how this was going to impact everything she stood for, everything she'd worked for. "This is just the beginning," she thought. "Today will be different." Jasmine Crockett was driving her BMW down the main road, weaving through the bustling neighborhoods of the city. The weather was perfect, clear skies with not a single cloud in sight. For a moment, she felt light and almost at peace, a rare sensation for someone always on the move. But as the clock on the dashboard flipped to 8:50 a.m., a sudden rush of anxiety shot through her, and her heart began to race. She had been sure she would make it to the courthouse on time, but the endless traffic, the cars lined up bumper to bumper, created an overwhelming sense of helplessness that built with every passing second. She steered the car through the intersections, trying to ignore the blaring horns and the temptation to let frustration take over. Every time she pressed the gas, her car would seem to slam into the invisible wall of traffic, the sense of time slipping away with each stalled moment. The anxiety began to claw at her, each second feeling more precious, more fleeting than the last. 8:55 a.m. time seemed to stretch and tighten around her like a vice. Every second felt like a challenge to her patience, her calm. She had meticulously prepared all the documents the night before, mapped out every step in her mind, and yet now it felt like all that work could be undone with just a minute's delay. This wasn't just another regular day at work for her. This was a significant opportunity, an opportunity to prove herself in a legal system she had long fought to be a part of, but one that was still riddled with challenges. A single delay could turn everything into chaos. The more Jasmine glanced at the clock, the more her anxiety grew. One more minute, she thought. Just one more minute, and it would all be ruined. She could almost hear the stern warnings she had received about Judge Anderson, the one infamous for his unyielding discipline and strict adherence to the rules. He had no tolerance for tardiness, especially from those who weren't local like her, someone with a history of working with government, but still an outsider in this tight-knit legal community. She forced herself to focus on the road ahead, yet as the cars remained stagnant, her fear crept in, clouding her thoughts. She could hear the screeching tires and honking horns, but all she could think about was how she would face the judge. Would he give her a chance, or would he hit her with an immediate penalty? When the clock on the car read 8:58, Jasmine couldn't help but exhale deeply. One more minute, just one more minute, and everything would change. It would only take a single minute to decide whether she could keep her professional life intact or whether everything she had worked for could unravel right in front of her eyes. She glanced at the side of the road and saw a truck suddenly switch lanes without signaling, forcing her to slam on the brakes. Panic surged through her veins, but she refused to let herself give in to the rising wave of fear. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She couldn't let the pressure overtake her, not now, not when she was so close. This was her moment to prove she could hold it together, to remind herself she wasn't going to let anything break her composure, not today. 9 a.m. As the traffic finally began to clear and Jasmine's car moved toward the courthouse, her heart raced, not with relief, but with an overwhelming sense of unease. The tightness in her chest didn't ease. 1 minute late. She knew it wasn't just an inconvenience. In this world, where every mistake was magnified and every misstep could be scrutinized, there was no room for error, especially not for someone like her, someone standing on the outskirts of this tightly controlled legal system. And that's when it hit her. The storm was about to break. Today wasn't just about a minor family case. It wasn't just another day in the courtroom. Today was a turning point. Today was about more than just the case at hand. It was about everything she had worked for, everything she stood for, and the very system she had spent years trying to navigate. Today, her life would change. 9:01 a.m. Jasmine Crockett stepped into the courthouse gates. Her pace hurried, but still maintaining the poise of someone who had faced formidable challenges before. A minute late. A single minute. So small, yet enough to make her heart race with tension. She had been sure that she would make it on time, but the cruel traffic and the countless obstacles along the way had conspired to test her. And now, she could already feel the weight of Judge Anderson's unforgiving gaze upon her. Judge Anderson was infamous for his rigid, no-nonsense approach. A minute late was not something he would tolerate, especially from someone like Jasmine, someone who wasn't part of the local system, someone who didn't share the history or the alliances that made others so comfortable in this courtroom. She had worked hard to build a name for herself, but in this moment, she was nothing but a minute late, a small mistake that could cost her everything. The vast hallway of the courthouse stretched before her, and the clack of her heels seemed to echo louder with every step, as if every footstep was being weighed, judged. She could feel the weight of every eye on her as she moved through the corridor, like an unseen presence watching her every move. The hushed whispers and sideways glances only made it worse. Jasmine was used to the feeling of eyes on her. She was no stranger to being the subject of judgment, especially as a black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated field. But this was different. This wasn't just about race, about being seen as an outsider. This was about power, the power of the system she had spent so many years fighting to be a part of, and the power of a judge who could either make or break her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had come this far. A minute wasn't going to define her. Still, the anxiety gnawed at her stomach, and she couldn't help but glance at her watch once more. Her heart was racing, her thoughts scattered. She could already feel the sense of impending doom. No matter how hard she tried to focus, the pressure seemed to press down on her, building and building with every passing second. When she reached the doors of the courtroom, she hesitated for a moment before entering. The air inside felt thick, heavy with expectation, with the weight of decades of legal tradition and silent power. She stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. And then she saw him. Judge Anderson was seated at the bench, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, those eyes were piercing, cold, and sharp. The moment they met hers, it was as though everything else in the room faded away. The rest of the courtroom seemed to vanish into the background. It was just the two of them now, the powerful judge who commanded the room and the woman who was now his target. He looked at her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine, his eyes narrowing as if he were already passing judgment. The silence in the room was suffocating. Jasmine felt every inch of her body tense up as she moved toward the front. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, the entire room watching, waiting for her next move. It was a feeling she had come to expect, but not like this, not with this level of hostility and disdain. She tried to steady her breath, tried to ignore the tightness in her chest, but it was impossible to escape the feeling that she was under siege. "Miss Crockett," the judge's voice boomed, cutting through the silence like a knife. It was deep and chilling, every syllable weighted with authority. "A minute late. 1 minute. And you think this is acceptable in a courtroom? A place for your petty excuses? You must be mistaken if you think you can waste my time like this." His words were like daggers, each one piercing into her pride, each one more cruel than the last. She felt herself shrinking under the weight of his gaze, the weight of his words. This wasn't just about a minute. This was about everything he thought she represented. The outsider, the woman who thought she could challenge the system. His contempt was clear, and Jasmine could feel it in the very air around her. She had never felt so small, so insignificant, so exposed. "You must think this is a joke," Judge Anderson continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "This is not some political stage for you to perform your theatrics. This is a court of law, and in my courtroom, we follow rules." He paused, letting the silence settle around her like a suffocating blanket. $500 for your disrespect. You will pay it for your tardiness, for wasting the court's time. If you can't even manage basic punctuality, how can you expect me to take you seriously?" The words hit her like a blow. $500. A fine. a sum that would have seemed trivial in most situations. But here, in this moment, it was more than just money. It was an insult, a slap in the face. It was an assertion of power, an attempt to crush her confidence and remind her of her place in this courtroom, in this system. Jasmine's mind raced. Her throat tightened as she struggled to find her voice, but the sting of the judge's words left her paralyzed. She wanted to speak, to protest, to explain that she had done nothing wrong, that she had worked her entire career to be here. But the disdain in his eyes silenced her. The room was too cold, too unforgiving, and the power he wielded was too overwhelming. Her hands clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her composure. She couldn't let him see the storm brewing inside her. She wouldn't let this moment break her, no matter how much it tried. The system had been built to break people like her, but Jasmine Crockett would not fall. As Judge Anderson turned his attention back to the case, dismissing her with a cold glance, she stood there, rooted to the spot. The courtroom was quiet again, but the weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but beneath that pounding, something else stirred, something defiant. This was not the end. She would not let this insult be the end of her story. Jasmine turned her gaze to the crowd in the courtroom, her eyes scanning the faces of the onlookers. She felt stripped of everything: her power, her confidence, her belief in the fairness of the system. But in that moment, as she stood there facing the harsh reality of her situation, a small spark of resolve flickered inside her. She was not going to let this moment define her. No matter what, she would rise above it. The fine wasn't just a punishment. It was a challenge that would test everything she had fought for. And Jasmine Crockett, despite the odds, was ready to face it head-on. Jasmine Crockett stood there, frozen in the cold courtroom, a simmering anger building up inside her as she realized she was being deliberately targeted. Judge Anderson's icy glare wasn't just a judgment on her being late. It was laced with deep-seated prejudice. This wasn't about time. It was about her, about who she was, about everything that made her different from the people who typically stood in this room. With his stern, sharp face, Judge Anderson had likely already decided Jasmine's fate the moment she stepped into the courtroom. He wasn't just a judge holding authority in this trial. He had a personal bias against her, one he didn't bother to mask. His gaze was filled with contempt, and it was clear to Jasmine that her presence in this court was nothing but an inconvenience to him. His bias wasn't expressed through words, but through every look, every movement, every condemning gesture that told her she didn't belong here. She wasn't just late. She was a young black woman, a person who didn't fit into the traditional mold of the legal world. The sting of this discrimination cut through Jasmine's chest like a knife, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. It wasn't just that she had been penalized for being 1 minute late. It was the way that minute had been used as an excuse to undermine her very existence in this room. As a black woman, young and outside the circles of old power in this system, she felt the full force of the judge's disdain. He was not simply angry at her tardiness. He was angry at the very fact that she was here at all. She wasn't a part of this system. She wasn't one of them. And in his eyes, that made her less than worthy of the seat she had fought so hard for. Jasmine thought back to the countless nights she had spent studying, struggling to get where she was, trying to prove to the world and to herself that she deserved to be here. As a black woman, she had always had to work twice as hard to gain recognition. But today, all of that effort felt like it had been undone in an instant. The sting of this injustice hit her like a cold slap in the face, reminding her of all the times she had been dismissed or looked down upon simply because of who she was. Judge Anderson clearly had no interest in someone like her. His decisions in this courtroom weren't just based on her actions. They were based on who she represented, on what he saw as an intruder in a space built for others. In his mind, Jasmine was an outsider, someone who didn't deserve to occupy this space of power, this space of justice. This discrimination wasn't just about a single minute of lateness. Jasmine could still hear the biting words he had spoken when she first entered the courtroom. Do you think this court is a place for young people like you? Do you think you have the right to even be here? Those words, though not directly offensive, were laced with so much underlying meaning, making it clear that Jasmine didn't belong here. People like her weren't meant to occupy the same space as those in power, those who had always held the reins of the legal system. She didn't belong in a room full of people who viewed her as a threat not because of what she had done, but because of who she was. Her frustrations swelled within her. It wasn't just the fine, it was everything that came with it. Jasmine wasn't just being judged for being late. She was being judged for every ounce of effort she had put into breaking down barriers, for every step she had taken to make a name for herself in an industry that had always been closed off to people like her. In the eyes of Judge Anderson, she wasn't a successful lawyer or a force to be reckoned with. She was an outsider, a black woman trying to break into a world where she wasn't wanted. The weight of that realization hit Jasmine harder than anything else. The contempt in Judge Anderson's every movement felt suffocating. She could feel the coldness of his gaze cutting into her, the disdain he held for her presence, the way he made it clear that she wasn't welcome here. This wasn't just about her career or the single case. It was about something much bigger. It was about the systemic injustice that had shaped every aspect of her life and career. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest, a sharp contrast to the icy calm of the courtroom. She was no longer standing there as a defendant in a case. She was standing there as a symbol of everything the system had tried to push down, to ignore. And she wasn't going to let it continue. The fire inside her burned brighter. She couldn't stay silent. She had fought too hard, for too long, to be silenced now. This wasn't just about a fine or a minute of lateness. It was about everything that had led her here. It was about the countless people who had been ignored, dismissed, and oppressed by a system built on inequality. Jasmine wasn't just fighting for herself now. She was fighting for everyone who had been made to feel less than. She wasn't going to let this man or this system define her, not anymore. Jasmine stood taller, the weight of her purpose surging through her. She would speak. She would make them hear her. The injustice of this courtroom, the systemic oppression, the bias, she faced it all ended today. She wasn't going to let herself be crushed beneath it. Not now. Not ever. Jasmine Crockett felt as though the entire world had come crashing down in that moment when Judge Anderson continued to publicly humiliate her. It wasn't just the $500 fine for being 1 minute late. It was the way he placed her in a category of those unworthy of even being there. Each of his words felt like a sharp blade slicing through her dignity. You don't belong here, Jasmine Crockett. You're a prime example of the disrespect that plagues this system. Judge Anderson's voice was cold, unyielding, and immediately every eye in the courtroom was on her. His words weren't just an indictment of her tardiness. They were a public disgrace, an attempt to tear down everything she had worked for over the years. Jasmine couldn't respond. She couldn't defend herself. The sense of public humiliation seeped into every fiber of her being, like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She stood there, struggling to hold back the tremors that were threatening to overwhelm her. All the eyes in the room were fixed on her now, but there was no compassion in their gaze, no understanding, only disdain and judgment. The judge's words were like a slap to her face, striking her with an intensity that left her feeling both hopeless and ashamed. This wasn't just about being late. It was about the judgment of her very being, about the fact that she didn't fit into the world he represented. A part of her wanted to fight back, to argue, but everything seemed locked away by an invisible wall that she couldn't break through. She felt like an outsider, someone with no place in this legal system, someone unworthy of being here. Judge Anderson's words kept coming, each one like a nail in the coffin of her self-worth. Don't think I'll turn a blind eye to this kind of disorganization. This system demands order, and you don't belong in it. Each phrase pierced through whatever confidence she had left, deepening her sense of loss and humiliation. She stood in a courtroom where fairness seemed like nothing more than an abstract concept, something unreachable for people like her. In that moment, Jasmine didn't just feel judged, she felt the absence of justice. This legal system wasn't for her. It wasn't for people like her, people without power, people who didn't belong to the elite circles of lawyers and judges. The feeling of rejection hit her like a wave, and it was as though her heart stopped beating. All the dreams she had fought for, all the years she had spent struggling to be seen and heard, felt like they were shattering before her eyes. And then, in the midst of her despair, a single thought flared up in her mind like a spark in the dark. I won't let this break me. The sting of being silenced and humiliated so publicly was overwhelming, but inside her, something began to ignite a quiet, burning resolve. She knew deep down that she couldn't let this moment pass without standing up for herself. She couldn't let him win. She couldn't let the system win, not like this. Though her body was still, her mind was racing. The flames of determination had started to burn, faint but growing stronger with every second. She wouldn't let this humiliation define her. She couldn't remain silent. Not anymore. Not when it meant sacrificing everything she had worked for. After Judge Anderson's public humiliation, the atmosphere in the courtroom seemed to come to a grinding halt, stifling and suffocating, thick with tension. Jasmine Crockett stood there, frozen in the wave of emotions crashing inside her. She could feel the ridicule from the judge, but what hurt more than anything was the deafening silence from everyone around her. No one spoke up. Jasmine turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the room, searching for even the faintest flicker of support. The people, from the audience in the gallery to the court officers, were all silent. No one sighed in sympathy. No one glanced at her with understanding or concern. Not a single person looked ready to stand up and defend her. Everyone was quiet, as if the injustice unfolding before them was something so ordinary, so easily ignored. It was as though the public humiliation of a black woman meant nothing to them. No one spoke. No one intervened. They all just watched as she was torn down, isolated in her fight for justice. The feeling of abandonment swept through her chest, a deep, gut-wrenching pain that seemed to press against her heart. She wasn't just being judged by Judge Anderson. She was now completely isolated in a space she had fought so hard to be a part of. The eyes around her weren't full of judgment. They were full of apathy. They didn't care. They weren't concerned with what was happening to her. Jasmine realized then that she was an outsider here. An outsider not just to the legal system, but to the very people who were supposed to uphold it. They didn't want to get involved. They didn't want to acknowledge her struggle. She felt as though she was being pushed outside the protective circle, as if she were an unwelcome presence, unworthy of belonging in this room of supposed justice. The sense of abandonment felt like a sharp blow to her heart. She had stood firm through countless battles, had fought tirelessly to get where she was, but now, standing here, she felt stripped of every bit of power she thought she had. Not only was she under attack by Judge Anderson, but she was now under siege by the silent complicity of everyone around her. No one was standing up to oppose the injustice she was facing. No one was on her side. They were silent. The silence in the room was as suffocating as the judge's harsh words. A part of her wanted to walk out of that courtroom, wanted to leave it all behind because in that moment, it felt like she had lost to the indifference of those around her. But a sudden, fierce sense of resolve ignited within her. She couldn't let their silence define her. She couldn't let it be the final word. In that moment, Jasmine realized that all the efforts she had put into making a place for herself, all the years of sacrifice, felt like they had been erased in an instant. She wasn't just being penalized for being late. She was being discarded, ignored, and rejected by a system that had never truly welcomed her. She was fighting not just against a small legal case, but against a system that had been built to push people like her to the margins. Her heart sank with the realization that in this world, there were people who would never speak up for fairness. They would remain silent because they had grown too accustomed to turning a blind eye to the wrongs around them. They had no interest in disrupting the status quo. And Jasmine, feeling more alone than ever, wondered if any of them truly believed in justice at all. Would they ever find the courage to challenge this system? Or was she the only one willing to speak out against the injustice? The silence of the courtroom seemed to echo through her soul, pressing on her chest. But deep within, a small fire began to burn. It wasn't over. Not yet. She wasn't going to let them ignore her fight. She wasn't going to be silenced. Not now. Not ever. The courtroom was silent, but inside Jasmine Crockett's mind, everything was in turmoil. Despite the public humiliation, despite being isolated, a fierce determination began to rise within her. Each of Judge Anderson's words still echoed in her head, but no longer as despair. Now they fueled a fire of defiance, burning fiercely in her heart. Jasmine looked down at her hands, clenched tightly around the case files, as if that physical grip could steady her racing thoughts. She couldn't allow this injustice to continue. This system was broken, and she couldn't stand idly by while it crushed people like her. She could no longer accept that this was all she could do in this courtroom. Every shred of humiliation, Every cutting word from the judge had only been the groundwork for her next move. It was time for her to rise. A sense of resolve filled her chest, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by this system. Those who didn't have a voice, those who would never be recognized by a legal system they had never been allowed to participate in. She was the symbol for those pushed out of this world, and if she didn't speak up, who would? It felt like a punch to the chest, sharp and final, pushing her forward. She thought about everything she had fought for, everything she had overcome, from the young girl struggling to be seen to the woman who had built her career with strength and resolve. If she didn't stand up today, tomorrow would hurt even more. Jasmine took a deep breath, feeling the tension rise in her chest. She couldn't give up now. She would fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been forced to endure the same injustice she had. 1 minute late didn't define the worth of a person. She was not the loser that this system wanted her to be. She was the one fighting for justice, and justice would prevail. Her eyes locked with Judge Anderson's, no longer filled with fear, but with resolve. I am not the only one who has had to endure this injustice, and I will not remain silent any longer. Her words rang out, strong and unwavering, like a declaration of war against every injustice she had faced throughout her life. Jasmine Crockett knew this battle wouldn't be easy, but today she would rise, not for herself, but for everyone without a voice, for everyone who had endured the kind of discrimination she had just suffered. She would face the judge, face this system, and refuse to let it destroy the values she had fought so hard to uphold. After standing motionless in the oppressive silence of the courtroom, Jasmine Crockett could feel each beat of her heart pulsing through her chest. The isolation from those around her still left her breathless, but in that moment, a tide of emotions surged within her, and a strong, unwavering resolve suddenly rose up inside her. She couldn't let this injustice continue. She couldn't let it go unchallenged. Judge Anderson remained completely indifferent, refusing even to acknowledge her presence, as if her being there were an affront to his power. But Jasmine could no longer remain silent, no longer stand still while he continued to crush both her career and her dignity. A fire ignited within her as she realized that if she didn't stand up now, she would lose everything she had fought for. The despair she had felt was gone, replaced by boldness, the courage to fight for justice. Judge Anderson, her voice rang out, firm and unwavering, not a hint of hesitation. The people around her began to turn their attention, snapping to her as if she had shattered the suffocating silence that had engulfed the courtroom. You will not speak to me like that. You cannot publicly punish me for a few minutes of tardiness like this. This legal system cannot continue to exist under the rule of people like you. Each word she spoke was a direct strike to the judge's authority. She was no longer afraid. She stood firm, refusing to bow to his power, and her words were a declaration of war, not only against Judge Anderson but against the entire unjust system he represented. I demand that you resign immediately, Jasmine continued, her voice sharper than ever. I will not accept this discrimination, and I will not remain silent while justice is violated. The tension in the courtroom thickened, the air suddenly heavy with anticipation. Everyone in the room could feel the shift in the atmosphere, as if the courtroom itself was witnessing an irreversible change. Judge Anderson, who had held this position of power for years, now seemed to falter. Each word from Jasmine seemed to pierce through his pride, striking directly at his ego. A moment of silence lingered. All eyes were on Judge Anderson, waiting for his reaction. Do you really think you have the right to demand that I resign? His voice, once cold and imposing, now held a trace of uncertainty. I believe I have the right to speak the truth, Jasmine replied, her voice unwavering. And I will do so, even if everyone in this room remains silent, even if I have to face your hostility. Although her heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling ever so slightly, her spirit was stronger than ever before. She no longer felt alone. This was not just her fight. It was the fight of all those who had been abandoned by the system, who had been treated as she was. And she would not remain silent any longer. As Jasmine Crockett stood firm on her feet, facing Judge Anderson in the thick tension of the courtroom, she knew she was up against something far from easy to overcome. Her determination and courage still burned bright within her, but now she had to face a monumental challenge. Judge Anderson, sitting in his position of power, showed no sign of backing down. The moment Jasmine finished her demand for his resignation, he shot her a cold, piercing glance. There was no empathy, no understanding in his eyes. Instead, he slammed his gavel down on the desk with a forceful thud, his voice now more grating and insulting than ever before. "Do you really think you have the right to demand that I resign, Jasmine Crockett? You're nothing but a rookie, someone who has no business in this courtroom." The judge's words hit Jasmine like sharp knives, each one striking at her pride and self-worth. "You don't belong here. You know nothing about the law, and certainly, you don't understand how justice operates in a courtroom. You're here just to make a mockery of us," Judge Anderson continued, his voice now a raging storm, battering her with every word. The entire courtroom fell dead silent. Jasmine could feel the eyes of everyone around her, but no one spoke out in her defense. The feeling of isolation washed over her more forcefully than ever. It wasn't just the judge criticizing her anymore. Now it was as if the entire system had turned its back on her. Desperation filled her as she looked toward Judge Anderson, realizing that he wasn't just a judge. He was the embodiment of the unjust system she was trying to change. His words were like a knife carving deeper into her belief in justice, making her heart tighten with every syllable. Each word he uttered felt like an assault on everything she had ever stood for. "You have no right to stand here and lecture me about justice." Judge Anderson pressed on, showing no sign of relenting, even as Jasmine tried to maintain her composure. "If you continue to disrupt this courtroom, I won't hesitate to make a decision you'll regret." A wave of despair surged inside Jasmine. She realized that this system wasn't willing to accept change. This wasn't just a battle with one judge. It was a fight against a system filled with power and hostility. She knew she couldn't win today, but perhaps she would have to sacrifice even more to continue fighting this fight to its end. The judge's words felt like confirmation of her defeat within this system. But Jasmine refused to let herself be broken. She had to stand firm, not just for herself, but for all the people who had been pushed aside by this very system, for those who had no voice, no power to challenge the discrimination and injustice. Despite the weight of the judge's words, despite the overwhelming odds against her, Jasmine knew she could not afford to retreat. The battle was bigger than one courtroom or one judge. This was a fight for the future, a fight for those who had been silenced, overlooked, and forgotten by a broken system. And Jasmine was determined to continue, no matter the cost. After the harsh insults from Judge Anderson, Jasmine Crockett felt as though she was being pushed to the edge of a precipice, where everything around her seemed uncertain and clouded. Despair once again took hold of her, and the heavy curtain of injustice draped over the room. She felt like a small stone caught in the current of a powerful river, isolated and insignificant. But in that very moment, something unexpected began to unfold. As Jasmine stood firm, maintaining her composure, she began to sense a shift in the air. A strange feeling began to rise within her, as if something unpredictable was starting to take shape. At first, she couldn't quite place it, but then she noticed the subtle glances, the sidelong looks filled with empathy that made her realize something she hadn't anticipated from the people in the courtroom. There were looks of understanding and quiet support. The individuals seated in the gallery, the court officers, and even a few people from the defense side no longer looked at her with contempt or indifference. A few people nodded, their nods small but meaningful, filled with silent empathy. An elderly man seated near the door looked at Jasmine with an expression that wasn't unfamiliar. He understood, a shared understanding that only those who had felt the crushing weight of a system like this could truly grasp. An older woman sitting in the front row clasped her hands together, her eyes glowing with a look that seemed to silently assure Jasmine that she was seen, that the woman's support was palpable. A few others in the room, though silent, gave small signs, slightly lowering their heads, wiping beads of sweat from their brows, actions that, while subtle, told Jasmine that they were connecting with her on some level. For the first time all day, Jasmine didn't feel alone in this fight. Even though Judge Anderson still maintained his cold, detached demeanor, sitting behind his desk of power, the looks from the people around her had shifted. They were no longer looks of disdain or indifference. These gazes were different. They spoke of something deeper, a realization that change was slowly beginning to take root in this courtroom. A flicker of hope began to grow inside Jasmine. She realized that even though the system seemed to be pushing her down, the people around her were beginning to recognize the injustice she was facing. Some couldn't speak out loud, but their small actions, their gentle glances, were signs of encouragement. It was as if they were silently saying that they stood with her. Jasmine understood that she was not alone. While she might not change the system today, each look, each gesture of support, was a testament to the fact that people could fight for justice. This realization filled her with a renewed sense of hope. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She was part of something bigger, a fight not only for herself, but for everyone who had been crushed by injustice before her. Jasmine smiled softly. She may not see the immediate results of her actions, but she knew she wasn't standing alone today. That in itself was an enormous encouragement to her, a sign that no matter how firm this system might seem, change could still begin with small acts, with subtle gestures, and with understanding eyes. Jasmine Crockett stood tall, her resolve and courage burning within her like an unstoppable fire. Everything she felt in that moment was crystal clear. If she did not act now, if she did not make a decisive demand, then the injustice would remain, and this legal system would continue to crush innocent people like herself and many others. The sting of Judge Anderson's insult still echoed in her mind. He had treated her as an outsider, someone with no right to speak in his courtroom. But now, Jasmine could no longer remain silent. A new, powerful force coursed through her, stronger than ever before. It was the unmistakable feeling of momentum building within her, a sense of purpose that overshadowed everything else. She didn't just want to stand up for herself. She wanted to expose the truth, change this unjust system once and for all. I demand not only an investigation into your conduct, Jasmine began, her voice still clear and unwavering, but now laced with strength, as though each word carried the weight of all the indignities and injustices she had suffered. I demand immediate reform in this court. The system cannot continue as it is. Independent reviews must be conducted on Judge Anderson's actions and on the bias he has shown throughout the years. She wasn't merely requesting an investigation. She was calling for a revolution in how cases were handled in this courtroom. Reform couldn't just stop at one individual. It had to be a complete overhaul of the way the entire system operated, so no judge, no one in power, could abuse their position to trample on justice and fairness. Jasmine knew her demand was not a small one. She wasn't just challenging a single judge. She was confronting a deeply entrenched power system built on discrimination, designed to protect those in positions of authority. But the fire inside her, the years of pent-up anger and frustration, had brought her to this moment, a moment she could not back away from. One investigation is not enough, she continued, her words cutting through the tension with increasing sharpness. I demand an independent review, not just of Judge Anderson, but of every judge in this court, so they can no longer act with bias and corrupt justice. With each word, Jasmine felt like she was landing a blow directly against the very system she had lived within. The sense of tension, determination, and audacity only grew stronger. She wasn't just standing here to defend herself. She was standing here for all those who had been discriminated against, for all those who had been abandoned by a system that was supposed to protect them. She knew today she was making the biggest challenge of her life, and it could very well mark a turning point in the fight for justice. The overwhelming momentum inside her drove her forward. She couldn't stay silent any longer. She couldn't let this injustice persist without doing something. Facing Judge Anderson, she could feel the entire courtroom holding its breath, waiting for her decision. And she made that decision, the decision that would change her life and possibly the lives of many others after that day. Jasmine Crockett's life would never be the same. She couldn't have anticipated the far-reaching impact her words in the courtroom would have, the powerful challenges she had issued, or the storm of attention they would spark. Just hours after her confrontation, a short video of the courtroom encounter was recorded and quickly shared across social media. At first, it was just a handful of people, those in the courtroom, colleagues, those who had been moved by the story. But before long, Jasmine's video began spreading like wildfire. With every view came hundreds, even thousands, of shares. It had never been seen before, a moment that generated such an immediate and widespread response. Social media exploded with activity. Hashtags like Justice for Jasmine and End Racial Bias began trending, and within 24 hours, Jasmine's story became a symbol of resistance against racial discrimination and injustice. A surge of excitement and anticipation filled her as she realized the strength of the community rallying behind her. Support poured in from all corners. Videos and posts condemning racial bias in the courtroom spread rapidly. Human rights organizations, lawyers, and even politicians began to speak out in support of Jasmine. Her story was no longer just about one court case. It had become a symbol in the battle against racial discrimination, a challenge to the bias embedded in the legal system, and a call for greater justice in society. Jasmine was flooded with messages of support from all over. Strangers, from city streets to celebrities, began to share her story. Small video clips were sent in by followers, thanking and congratulating her for standing up and bringing the truth to light. They saw her as a hero, a voice for those who had suffered discrimination but lacked the ability to speak out. One video in particular caught Jasmine's attention. A Black mother shared her own experience of being discriminated against in the legal system, and it was shared widely, receiving millions of views. The overwhelming emotions Jasmine felt intensified as she realized that her story had gone beyond herself. It had touched the hearts of millions. The video's spread wasn't just powerful in its social influence. It began to spark a shift in societal thinking. Discussions on racial bias in the legal system flourished on major news sites. Television networks invited her for interviews, and human rights organizations worldwide began calling for legal reforms. The overwhelming support from the community made Jasmine smile in disbelief. She was no longer a lone figure in the face of this system. She had become a representative for all those who had been silenced, for those who had lived in the shadows of injustice. She felt she was doing something profoundly meaningful, and it wasn't just her personal fight. It was the fight of every individual who had ever been wronged by a system that turned its back on them. The excitement she felt, seeing the empathy and support from the community, only fueled her determination further. She knew this battle was just beginning, but the power of the people behind her made her feel like she had an army standing with her. And this was the pivotal moment to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had silently endured for years. When Jasmine Crockett looked at her phone, she could hardly believe her eyes. With every passing second, the number of posts, comments, and calls for justice for her surged across social media platforms. Within just 24 hours, her story had attracted enormous attention from human rights organizations, celebrities, and everyday citizens. A powerful wave of support seemed to have been triggered, with posts demanding justice for Jasmine and online discussions happening everywhere at all hours. The posts sharing her story continued to multiply, and hashtags like Justice for Jasmine and End Racial Bias became symbols of resistance against racial discrimination in the legal system. Never in her life did she imagine that after a single courtroom confrontation, she would receive such overwhelming support from the community. Jasmine felt as if she had been empowered by voices from all directions, from people she had never met, from those who had long been forgotten by society. People weren't just expressing sympathy, they were taking action. Many began to share their own stories of racial discrimination in courtrooms and in everyday life. Human rights and justice organizations started reaching out to Jasmine, urging her to participate in protests and campaigns to raise awareness about the injustices within the legal system. This made her realize she was no longer an isolated individual. She had become a representative of a growing movement. Across news outlets and TV channels, coverage about Jasmine began to spread. Interviews with her appeared on popular talk shows, while activists rallied to encourage people to join Jasmine in creating a revolution in the legal system. This wave wasn't just support for Jasmine. It was a collective voice for everyone who had suffered injustice but lacked the courage to speak out. The sheer strength of this growing wave made Jasmine feel as though she had sparked an unstoppable movement. The belief in change had never been clearer. She no longer felt like just a woman wronged by the system. She was now a part of a global fight. Every word of support from the community fueled the fire of hope, not just for Jasmine, but for everyone who had suffered injustice in a society marked by discrimination. Protests began to erupt in major cities, with people pouring into the streets demanding justice for Jasmine. The hope that Jasmine now felt was a powerful wave that couldn't be extinguished. She knew that she was no longer fighting alone. This was a struggle that had been born from the very communities that had been marginalized. Jasmine was no longer just a person standing up for justice. She had become a symbol of change. The belief in transformation filled her heart, and everything she had done hadn't just altered her life. It had awakened a global society. The just future she had once dreamed of was now within reach. She realized that this community could change the world. When the news of the investigation into Judge Anderson was made public, a massive wave swept through society. The truth about his racism was finally brought to light, no longer hidden behind the facade of his powerful position as head of the courtroom. This was a victory Jasmine had fought for tirelessly over months, but the feeling of victory was not at all what she had imagined. Seeing Judge Anderson's name appear in the headlines, Jasmine didn't feel the complete satisfaction she had expected. Instead, she felt a strange pain. Pain because she had faced discrimination for far too long. Pain because she had paid such a heavy price to expose this injustice. The sense of victory was incomplete, as all the scars, the insults she had endured over the past months, seemed still raw and unhealed. Still, Jasmine could not deny one truth. The system was beginning to change. This was her first victory, and it was not just hers but the victory of everyone who had ever been oppressed, discriminated against, with no one to stand up for them. And though the pain lingered, Jasmine realized that this was just the beginning. There were signs of change today, but the battle would be long. The response from the community began to spread rapidly, as people across the country demanded justice and ensured that no judge could abuse their power as Anderson had. Human rights organizations and lawyers from multiple countries sent letters calling for urgent measures to end racial discrimination in the courts. An independent investigation was immediately launched to examine Judge Anderson's actions in the past. The feeling of victory was no longer a simple joy. Jasmine knew that every step she took in this fight was a step forward, not just for her, but for all those who had ever been discriminated against, treated unjustly. She had succeeded in bringing the truth to light, but she also realized that true change would require time and effort from all of us. Yes, Judge Anderson was under investigation, but the real change would lie in whether the legal system itself would truly change. That was the question Jasmine held in her heart as she lifted her head, noticing the eyes of those around her beginning to look at her with respect. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for all those who couldn't speak for themselves. The day everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. Judge Anderson, who had sat on the seat of power for over 3 decades, was forced to face the consequences of his actions. Under immense pressure from public opinion, independent investigations, and the voices of the community, he made a decision that shocked the entire society. He resigned. Jasmine Crockett's sense of victory was undeniable. After all that she had endured, from the insults in the courtroom to the relentless struggle, she had succeeded in removing Judge Anderson from his powerful position. She could feel a deep sense of pride as she witnessed the downfall of a corrupt element within the system that she had fought so hard against. This was a monumental victory, a victory for truth, justice, and courage. However, the feeling of triumph was not as sweet as she had imagined. When Jasmine read the news of Judge Anderson's resignation, a strange sadness welled up within her. She felt disappointed, realizing that while the system that Anderson represented had been challenged, it had not been completely transformed. The old system still had too many loopholes, too much hidden injustice and discrimination, and Jasmine knew she could not change it all by herself. This is a victory, but it's a victory in a much larger battle, Jasmine thought quietly to herself. She knew that even though Anderson had resigned, the fight was far from over. His resignation may have been a setback for an abuser of power, but it was also a reminder that the legal system still needed a complete overhaul. What troubled her most was the realization that even though Judge Anderson was gone, he had represented an undeniable part of the system. His resignation wasn't the result of real reform, but merely a temporary measure to appease public outrage. It was a singular punishment, but not a real change in the core of the legal system. Jasmine wondered, was this the first step toward true change? Or was it just a temporary act to restore a false sense of peace without any profound transformation in how justice was administered? She didn't know the answer, but she knew that this battle would not be easy to stop. This great victory still felt overshadowed by the potential failings of the old system, a system that could still nurture people like Anderson. But at least she knew that today, a step had been taken, and it had opened the door to a future of greater fairness. And perhaps those who came after her would not have to face the same injustices. Immediately after Judge Anderson's resignation, a wave of reform began to spread throughout the judicial system. Investigations and reports were launched, and over the following months, a series of reforms began to be implemented to reduce bias and racial discrimination in the courts. Independent reviews of judges' behavior and retraining across the entire judicial system became official measures aimed at purging the justice sector. The sense of optimism that filled Jasmine was shared by everyone who had stood by her during this long and difficult journey. Finally, after years of suffering, the system was beginning to acknowledge its flaws and slowly change. Those in the advocacy community, those who had supported her, now felt as though the door to justice was finally starting to open. However, despite these clear advances, Jasmine couldn't shake the quiet sense of worry growing inside her. She knew that this reform was just beginning and that significant transformation still had to happen. But she also acknowledged that change couldn't come overnight. Judges, lawyers, and those with authority in the legal system wouldn't easily change, and Jasmine understood that many would resist reform because they were so accustomed to the old ways, where power and discrimination ruled. Additionally, there was a small wave of resistance from those within the legal system who felt threatened by these changes. Some long-standing judges and attorneys opposed the independent oversight and reviews, arguing that it undermined their autonomy. But Jasmine couldn't let this small opposition divert her from her mission. She knew that reform would take time, but the important thing was that change had begun. Hope for the future began to grow stronger in Jasmine's heart as she saw specific reforms being implemented. Programs addressing racial discrimination were being introduced in courts, and judges were required to take courses on equality and human rights. This had a profound impact on Jasmine, as she realized that while these changes were small, they could be the first step toward rebuilding the legal system for the future. She couldn't help but feel optimistic and hopeful seeing these changes unfold. But there was still a lingering fear in her heart. Would the old practices truly be erased, or would they quietly persist in the dark corners of the legal system? Jasmine understood that this fight would never be over, but today she felt that they had won a crucial battle. However, this reform marked a major turning point, not just for Jasmine, but for everyone who had dared to stand up for justice. They had overcome their fear and fought not only for themselves, but for all those oppressed and forgotten in society. This reform was a declaration that no form of discrimination could ever exist in the legal system again. After the long battle, not only in the courtroom but in the hearts and minds of millions, Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a victor in a legal case. She had become a symbol of justice, an emblem of resilience in the relentless fight against racial discrimination. A sense of pride enveloped Jasmine as she realized that she had truly changed the lives of thousands. Her fight had opened a new era, not only in the courtroom but in the hearts of every citizen who had silently endured discrimination without anyone to stand up for them. She had become the beacon of hope, lighting the way for those who longed for justice. The pride she felt came not only from her victory, but also from the recognition from the community. Those who had supported her, who had fought alongside her, now looked at Jasmine with respect and admiration. Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a lawyer. She was a symbol of change, perseverance, and the belief in justice that she had fought to make a reality for everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background. Not only a victor, Jasmine Crockett transformed herself from a victim of oppression and discrimination into a leader in the fight for justice. She became a lecturer, mentor, and an inspiration to the next generation of lawyers, who looked to her as a role model for the spirit of resistance and the ability to overcome adversity. A sense of fulfillment filled Jasmine's heart as she realized that not only had she changed herself, but she had brought about profound change within the system. Her lectures, where she shared her experiences, strategies, and lessons learned from her fight against injustice, had become invaluable resources for young lawyers who would continue the battle in courts and in the broader society. Jasmine didn't just teach them about law. She taught them about courage, perseverance, and the pursuit of justice. Her talks and lessons resonated not only in academic circles, but also rippled through the community, sparking a wave of advocacy for rights and fairness among every citizen and organization. Jasmine had changed the system from within, paving the way for young, passionate lawyers to continue fighting for what is right. But Jasmine's journey did not end there. Though she had become a symbol of justice, true justice is not something anyone can achieve in a lifetime. Jasmine knew she would never stop until everyone had access to justice and racial discrimination was entirely eradicated from the legal system. The story did not conclude with a satisfying resolution. Jasmine continued her journey, not just for herself, but for all those who had been denied justice. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult and long, but she also knew that every step, every action she took, would continue to have a profound impact on the world around her. The relentless drive to keep fighting and the hope for a more just world was the driving force in Jasmine's life. She had never been satisfied with what she had achieved, and she would never stop until everyone could stand firm within this legal system without the fear of discrimination. Jasmine Crockett, no longer just a victor, was an endless source of inspiration, a symbol for all those who fight for what is right, and a leader in the revolution against racial discrimination in the legal system.